Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for coming today. I see that we have quite a few of us already in the room, so I think we can certainly get started. So let me just briefly introduce ourselves. So I'm Amanda Key. I'm overseeing the Youth Opportunities Platform at ABPN. With me at the ABPN team are my colleagues Saransh, Lavanya, and Sajal. So welcome to the platform's first deep dive. Our deep dives are a little different from our usual because this one will be youth-led and it will be driven by one of our young impact leaders, Richa. So just on a personal note and maybe to get everyone on board. So I got to know Richa actually last year when we invited her to be part of the inaugural cohort of the ABPN Young Impact Leaders. And I remember being so blown away by the incredible work that she has done thus far for underserved youth and children in India. So if you have seen the short film that we had shared just now at the beginning of the session, you see how she's really on that mission to drive or to make social emotional learning accessible through her organization, Labhya Foundation. And in the last few months, as I've been speaking with her through our various engagements with the ABPN Youth Opportunities Platform, I'll say that Richa really works round the clock and staying really incredibly humble and earnest through it all. Supriya, you have been a long-time friend of ABPN through your time with LGT Venture Philanthropy. So LGTVP is what we call a conscientious funder who looks out for opportunities where others have not noticed and really takes that big picture view in your philanthropic strategy. And I think it is through these learning spaces like this one here that we have today that we can bring leaders from very different fields of work together to ask each other questions, challenge one another and really pave a way forward together. So I would say in the next 75 to 90 minutes, we will be learning what it takes to fund systems change. And that's why all of you are here today with us. And have our speakers really share your experience in advocating for this from really two sides of the same coin. And then I think in the next second half of this session, we will break up into smaller groups so that we can also hear from more of all of you as well. So without further ado, we are excited to first invite Richa to take the stage and share with us how she has come to lead really one of the world's largest social emotional learning program, the challenges she has faced to bring also like-minded funders with her along the way. So Richa, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amanda. Firstly, extremely grateful to the ABPN team and the Youth Opportunities Platform for creating the space for young people to really genuinely take the center stage. I, along with the 9 other young impact leaders, are just always excited to engage in this space and truly learn and go back with more and more incredible questions. And grateful to be doing this with Supriya this afternoon in India. But I'm sure everyone here is joining from various different time zones. My name is Richa. As Amanda introduced me, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Labhya, and in a very brief way explaining what Labhya does. As you saw in the video, we partner with state governments across India to help them introduce emotional well-being into public schools across the state. And so just like our children have a math or a science or an English class, now they have something called as a well-being class, which hopefully gives them the right kind of skills to be able to cope with poverty and become effective learners from the get-go. So that's a little bit about what Labhya does. I'll quickly share a slide to start our discussion off on what are some challenges that a youth-led nonprofit like Labhya has faced in the past and continue to face, and also share more about what hopes we have, from our discussion today. And at Labhya, we call our challenges opportunities for hope. So there's just one slide which has both the challenges and the hopes. Let me know when you can see my screen. Can you see a big blue screen?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So great. So four of the core challenges that Lambhya has faced over the past 5 years of us being on the ground and truly trying to shift the needle at the systems and the school level. One has been just developing not being able to develop an understanding of systems change amongst resource providers in general. This is something that is still seen as a little bit intangible, when in fact it is the aspiration of actually almost all nonprofits and social enterprises that we have spoken with. And so the hope for today is to really truly understand, especially in LGT's context, what systems change really means and what it means to support programs that are running at a systems and a government partnership level. The second is having faith in young founders in general. There is a lot of opportunity out there to really, really, truly trust young founders. We are 100% all in, and a lot of the work that we do is truly because of the lived experiences that we've had that fuel the work that we do. And over time, of course, credibility gets built, but would love to speak more to what it would take to build a common understanding of what it means to be a young entrepreneur and what unique challenges we might face that resource providers could help us with specifically. The third is early stage unrestricted resources, something more trust-based, something experimental, to truly demonstrate to young founders and young enterprises that you go ahead and we are backing you and we'll see what happens and how we can make it more evidence-based as we go along as true partners. And lastly, my hope is to understand how us as resource providers and also mentors who are in the call today. I see some of the advisors that were assigned to me by AVP and also in the audience. How can we really build the capacity of young organizations while, of course, providing them with the necessary resources and what that looks like for early stage organizations? So those were a couple of my hopes and some of the challenges that we have faced in the past, but hopefully today we'll get to talk more to these. And yes, hopefully that helps us kickstart our discussion today with Supriya. Hi, Supriya, how are you doing this afternoon?
Hi, Richa. Doing very well. I want to thank AVPN and you for this great opportunity. It's seldom we get the chance to explore the meaning of, words like systems change, creating impact at scale, and explore both sides of the coin. So very excited for that.
Thank you, Supriya. So Supriya, let's start with a quick curiosity, that me and I'm sure many other founders in the room have, which is tell us more about LGTVP's philanthropy strategy. We would love to know what it means for you to support long-term systems change and what do emerging fields also mean to you in the philanthropy that you do.
Sure, Richa. So LGT Venture Philanthropy was set up in 2007 by the princely family of Liechtenstein, which is a small country near Switzerland. We began our philanthropic investments in India around 2009. And right from the beginning, we adopted a venture capital approach almost, which was influenced by our sister concerns, Lightrock in India, which does a lot of impact investing, and also our bank's work. And if you look at our team, we're mainly comprised of people who are crossovers from the investment banking venture capital side. And so what that meant to us was really identifying scalable solutions and strong founders and teams that we could back. So that's how we started our philanthropy. What we realized very early in our journey was that there was a significant gap in India in terms of funding, which was that the focus was on short-term programmatic funding. And what that did to organizations was to restrict vision in a certain way and to think more short-term and not long-term in terms of how do you move the needle in this sector, how do you work closely with government systems, how do you create long-term behavior change, etc., which takes multiple years to do. So what we decided then was to focus our investments on supporting organizations rather than programs. And we said, let's focus on building out areas of the organization like human resources, like impact, data, technology, communications, etc. And we provided multi-year flexible funding to these organizations. Maybe a quick example is that we were Educate Girls' first institutional investor in India, and we've supported them as well as Angan, which works on child protection for over 12 years now in India. And our strong belief and also the feedback that we get is that we have supported the organizations in thinking big, in moving the needle in this sector, and also getting ready in terms of building organizational resilience to attract other big ticket funding.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I feel like this is music to my ears. Everything that I think a nonprofit needs, which is genuinely investing in the organization, of course, and the program is an obvious byproduct of that, a high quality program. And investing in organization health, right? So that we make sure that organizations become resilient, founders feel, and the teams feel secure as they move ahead in shifting the needle, while also navigating the uncertainties of working at systems change, like working with government partners, etc. So thank you so much for sharing that. A follow on to that, it might, I can imagine how hard it must be to identify organizations that are at the right intersection of all of these things for you. And so what are some key considerations that you see while identifying potential portfolio organizations for LGT? And give us an example of an interesting partnership that you may have had recently that truly embodies the value system that LGT likes to demonstrate.
Absolutely, Richa. No, I think spot on in terms of identifying these organizations, which is very key for us. And so a significant amount of time goes into landscaping the sectors that we're interested in and looking at these various organizations, right? And so three main things I would say that we look at. One is the solution itself. The second is the team, the founder and the team. And the third is the potential relationship that we could share with the organization. So when you look at the solution, for us, key considerations are, is it a scalable solution? And a big part of that is government partnerships and how embedded the solution is within government. And I think like Labhya does that so well. I think those are the kinds of organizations that we look for where there is a scalable model already. The second aspect is sustainability of that solution. So, has the team, the founder thought through how the solution would sustain, exit strategies, what would happen to the communities that they work with post exiting? That's another key consideration. The third, which you alluded to earlier, is the evidence-based approach, right? So, it's music to funders' ears, I guess, to have an evidence data-backed, approach, and that's something that either we look for with our organizations or we help support through our journey with the organizations. And finally, we look at cost effectiveness, which is still an underdeveloped area, especially in certain sectors. I mean, you would find it a lot more with education, etc. But to identify, is there a good social return on our investment, a good bang for the buck, if we could call it that, in terms of the solution. So the solution is one big aspect. The second big aspect is the team. So with the team, we look at having an entrepreneurial sort of founder, a visionary founder, and a very dynamic team. We also look at, of course, sector expertise to be able to trust in that team, because working on systems change means you trust the team to be flexible, to pivot models. And so looking for people who know their space really well and who we believe can move the needle in the sector. So I think team is a second important part. The third is the relationship that we could potentially share. We are very hands-on funders. When it comes to working with the organization, we love to add value, bring in expertise from the rest of our portfolio, etc. And so is the organization open to having that kind of relationship? And is the organization transparent and open in sharing not just the success stories, but also some of the challenges that the organization is facing, so that we can sort of come in there and see if we can provide either ourselves or rely on other experts to bring in the support that's needed. So I think these are the three broad areas that we look at.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's really interesting. And it's interesting to also see and imagine what over the 10 or 12 or 15-year period, the support to the organization might evolve like, right? Maybe when you begin, it starts with some basic capacity building, and how over time it develops into a true authentic relationship where people can share their failures, their successes, what's working and what's not. That's looking like an entire lifetime of an organization as partners. Really incredible. Nice. Could you share with us any examples of a nonprofit or a social enterprise that you supported, and how that relationship came about?
Absolutely. So I think, Richa, we're very proud of our portfolio overall. We have, exemplar organizations in our portfolio. But if I were to highlight maybe a couple of quick examples, one would be Angan. So the organization working on child protection, who we have been supporting for the last 12 years or so. I think one key aspect which differentiates sort of us as funders and our work with Angan is providing the flexibility to pivot strategy when needed. And so, for example, a lot of Angan's initial work was around post-harm, so working with children who had already faced harm through childcare institutions. And in between, Angan sort of reached out to us and said, how about we start looking at prevention even before the child has to face the harm? Why don't we build in systems? Why don't we pivot our strategy to look more at prevention? And in order to do that, we would have to work a lot with the systems around the child. So with the community, with the family, with the police systems to target and identify these vulnerable hotspots, with the government, etc. And so how do we support Angan with that strategy shift was our key concern. And there we supported them with a pilot. They were able to achieve a good result with that pilot in Rajasthan. And today they've scaled across all of the police departments across the state where they're working on child protection, right? So that's one key area. A second area we supported them on was the evidence building and data that's been so key to say, how do we identify the vulnerable spots, the hot spots, and target our interventions there. And so they recruited women volunteers from these communities to collect this data, and that's been incredible in shaping and designing their program. So I think, just working on some of these organizational areas like partnerships or data or evidence building to create these pivot and strategies and almost allow the organization the flexibility to think big. That's where we really came in. So that's one great example. Another more recent example we have is with an organization called Foundation for Ecological Security, where again, we supported them with their core implementation work, but today they're thinking a lot more in terms of how do we work with district governments, block governments, to bring about a change in common lands and to get people's entitlement to common lands. So again, the shift to more systems thinking, government partnerships thinking is something we've been doing with them. These are a couple of examples from our portfolio.
Thank you so much for sharing, and that sounds like incredible work.
Thanks, Richa. And I would love to understand from your perspective as a young founder, what you think of systems change, and to the challenges that you mentioned earlier. What are some areas where funders like us or ecosystem builders like us could invest in, and how do we work towards that?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for asking that, Supriya. For us, actually, the understanding of systems change and the nomenclature honestly came much later. The concept came to us first. And as young people, we were slightly impatient when we started the work. And although we truly believed in our work, but we always kept on thinking, what if I get removed from the system? What happens if my volunteers get out? And initially it was a small pilot. And I think that's what got us thinking about who was the biggest change maker in the country who could truly take this work forward, especially working on something like emotional well-being. It truly needs a certain narrative shift to happen across multiple stakeholders, like you mentioned, for similar to child protection, for the needle to truly shift. And we can do some wonderful work at the schools level, at the teachers level, at the head of school level. But at the end of the day, it needs to become the priority of this education system as a whole. And that's what sort of started us off thinking about systems change. And luckily, being at the right place at the right time, in 2018, we partnered with our first state government, which really catapulted our growth, not only in terms of the number of children we were working with, the scale that we were working with, but also the growth that our team itself had. We truly had the privilege to learn about systems change by working in the system. And that's how we learned how to do the work that we do and developed our own instincts as a nonprofit. So I think that's where sort of our journey started. And coming to your question around, what priorities could be focused on by resource providers who focus on young people and emerging fields. I think the first primary support that we need as young founders, if I look back, at the journey, some of the most catalytic support systems that we have seen have been more around, of course, funding, early stage, unrestricted, making sure that we have room to experiment, we have room to fail in the early days, especially when we were doing something which has largely not been done in the country at the scale that we were doing it at. And so everything had to be carefully benchmarked, because it's very easy to have a mediocre benchmark when you're doing something for the first time. And so how could we keep raising the bar? So understanding from our funders that this is something that will keep evolving and we have to keep experimenting, and to leave room for that in the support that they provided to us. The second thing was strategy. For us to be able to think long term, some of the most catalytic support that we have received has been, okay, let's look at the next 5 years. What can we do? Knowing that things will change, systems will change, you're working with governments. How can we really build a long-term thinking plan for us as we move ahead? And that has been really, really helpful, especially in the last 2 to 3 years as we look ahead to our audacious goal of reaching 30 million children by 2030. And what does that really mean for the organization, for our program, for our people, and for the stakeholders that we are working with? Lastly, I think our best supporters have been those who have really understood the audacity of what we bring, right? And who have really understood that our own lived experience is what drives us. And of course, expertise is something we have built over time. And so people who don't get scared by the 30 million, who say, okay, that's not enough, let's do more, are people who have usually been, people who have supported us for the long term. So those are some of the areas that I think are really important while looking at supporting youth-led opportunities or youth opportunities and areas in general.
Thank you for sharing, Richa. And I think, I completely align with what you say, especially when you're talking about unrestricted funding, investing in long-term strategy, and thinking big, right? And hairy, audacious goals. I think that's what we also see on the other side, that working with funders who think like that is what yields results. And it may not reach every number that's been laid out, but I think that's where we see progress and we see potential to move the needle in the sector. So completely align on that. And to that, if you could share one example of a partnership that Labhya has had, where you've seen the partner really understanding the nuances and the complexities of thinking about systems change, of thinking about such large goals. If you could share one great example.
Absolutely. I have to say that all of our partners have been really, really incredible. And at various stages, they have truly trusted us and our audacity and sometimes foolishness also, I would say. But I think one partner which has really stood their ground with us over the years has been Max India Foundation, and their entire leadership team and their CSR team have been really open-minded to the work that we have been doing. In fact, their first test grant to us last year was so catalytic that that was actually the first grant we used to work on deep monitoring and evaluation. They truly understand the slowness of the work. They truly understand how much resilience we need to build in the system for the work that we do. And then this year, of course, they have supported us at an org level. And I think that really helped us to think about what is next, and not from a survival mode. As our team grows, the anxieties also grow as a founder. And I think it really helped us build a senior leadership team that is strong enough, experienced enough to take the organization forward for the next 10, 12 years. And that has been really, really helpful. The fact that they fully trusted us and also understand the program fully, and are able to also point out where we are going wrong and point out what we need to do more in our strategy. I think it's been a wonderful, wonderful partnership. And I think the second most recent partnership that we have had the privilege to go through is the DRK Foundation, Draper Richards Kaplan. They also provide multi-year institutional grants. They're our first international institution to support us. And they have been incredible at being our champions globally, and really putting us on a platform where we could genuinely share our story and our struggles and gather more support. So these two, out of all the amazing people, these two is something I could share for today.
Wonderful. No, thank you for that. And I think just to hear that you like funders who sort of work very closely with you, are patient with their capital, understand what could go wrong and help solve through those challenges is exactly what we would love to hear and do with our organizations as well. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. And now that you speak about your organizations, would love to know from all the founders sitting here in the room today, what would you tell entrepreneurs in this room, and how should they position themselves to better receive funding that is more strategic, long-term, and support-based?
Sure, Richa. So I think this feeds a lot into the discussion that we've had already on the kinds of organizations that we like to support. But I think one thing I would really like to say is, focus on your vision. This long-term thinking that we spoke about. It's very easy to get distracted with, short-term funding that comes in with, multiple pots that can be tapped into, and I think it's good to identify a few aligned funders, like you mentioned a couple of examples with DRK. So I think identifying those funders who can support with your larger vision, who allow you to sort of have that room to experiment. That's very key. And I think it's always good to approach a funder, similar to the Angan example that I mentioned, to say, we would love to do a pilot, that this is one area of the strategy we've identified, and we want to go deeper into that. And then look at potentially scaling things up. I think having that open conversation is really key. And so focusing on that vision, that big picture thinking is one. A second is, again, to our earlier discussion around a strong data and an evidence-based approach is really key. It not only helps with the program design and building in feedback loops into the program, but it also helps in building more attractiveness around the work that you're doing, not just for funders, but for government, for other key stakeholders as well. So that data evidence-based approach is another key aspect. And the third is just thinking and building sustainability into program design from day one. So how can communities that you support continue to function once Alabhya and Angan has exited that particular community? Thinking about that from day one is key as well. And cross-cutting all of this is just having a great, open, transparent relationship, which is the onus of both the funders as well as the organizations, I would say, to build that.
Absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense. And especially if I could relate it to the work that we're doing, thankfully, there has been so much conversation around emotional well-being and mental health, unfortunately, because of COVID in the last 2.5 years. And yet, there is, of course, capital has to catch up to the narrative, and more needs to be done. But at the same time, like you mentioned, there are many distractions possible, right? right? EdTech, all of these other things that are happening. And so for an organization working on systems change, how can we truly stay on the path while also innovating to the focused area that we want to solve for and the problems that we need to solve for? That's really incredible. And I think that's the perfect segue into our next section, where we would love to hear from all of our other attendees in the room today. And so for that, I will hand it over to Amanda to lead us.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Richa and Supriya, for the great conversation. Maybe just to summarize a few things I've heard from both of you as well. Richa, you mentioned that really one of the key challenges amongst founders and young founders is really to advocate and to demonstrate the impact of systems change, right? And you were also saying that in response to that, really the best support that founders like you might need would be the kind of early stage catalytic funding to provide that room to fail, to support long-term thinking, and really have that, as you mentioned, also the faith in that sort of audacious vision and really trust in that process. Supriya, from your side as a funder, you at the start mentioned the funding gap in India and how there might be a lot of short-term funding, which limits vision. So I think some advice, or rather you felt that there is a need to invest in the organization instead of programs, because good programs, as Richard mentioned, is really a byproduct of a good organization. So thanks for sharing all of these. So right now, as Richard mentioned, we'll be splitting ourselves into two groups to really discuss three questions. And I'm just going to share my screen so that everyone can see it as well. Right? So three questions here. First, do you agree with the funding barriers and approaches that the speakers have shared? In your experience, what innovative financing vehicles or best practices have you seen that could address some of these funding barriers? Or also facilitate some of these funding approaches that Richa and Supriya have mentioned. And the third would be, what steps might you be able to take or aspire towards to support this movement towards long-term capital in emerging fields, whether it's social emotional learning, mental health, and other youth development areas. So what will happen now is that Saransh from the AVPN team will put a link to the GEM board in this chat box. The GEM board, for some of you who might not have used it before, is a collaborative board where you can write down your responses to these questions. The AVPN team as well will be joining the rooms to hear you share further, and will jot down more of your elaborations and insights. Richa and Supriya will be your facilitators, so this will be also a good time for everyone to engage further with them. Okay, so Saransh, if you are ready, may I ask if you could break us up into our groups, please?
Yes, just give me a minute.
In the meantime, everyone can think about what you would like to share. You might already start, if you're on the GEM board, start sharing or putting down some thoughts.
Hi, welcome everyone. Saransh, have we assigned the breakouts?
Yes.
Great. So it would be lovely to start getting initial thoughts of the group on the three questions. Why don't we start with the first one around the funding barriers and approaches? Would anyone like to weigh in?
Hi, I'm Titash from Chain Fusion, Thailand. So one of the barrier that funding barrier that maybe in Thailand that we do not most of the Thai organization like entrepreneur support organization or even the organization do maybe focus on certain funding agency just such as like NIA, which is a national innovation agency from the Thai government, or some other government related incubation or entrepreneurial support agency that are not as incentivized to the youth leadership that would engage with this kind of approach. And because they somewhat government agencies, so they react quite slowly and not as innovative as we would like to be. And for even though for us as well, that's why we have to seek out donor or the funder from international impact investor or agency to, and we would seek, I would say, each specific donor have specific requirement or criteria for us or even for any ESO to implement. So that could be one of the barriers, like different criteria from different organizations require different implementation plan.
Absolutely. And so if very interesting to hear that these different sort of requests that come in actually weigh on the innovation of the organization, right? And the ability for the organization to experiment. Could you maybe share one example of how that applied with your organization?
Let's say one of the organizations that requires to implement or focus more on gender inclusivity, and we have to adapt that with the youth engagement level. But because of the gender inclusion or gender lens or become a gender smart organization, actually kind of apply to the youth engagement already. So it become a streamlined process. But in case of some other requirement that could be more elaborate, it would be a bit more challenging to implement for organization without the expertise on particular field.
Understood. And that's a great example. And I think then, sort of when we look at a recommendation to funders through this example, it is that, work together to support organizations on a common agenda on the organization's vision, rather than sort of pulling in different directions, right? If that could be one sort of solution. I think we as an organization also look to do things like that and collaborate with other funders. That's a great point. Anyone else who would like to weigh in on funding barriers that you've faced?
I think potentially I could share. I think for us, Labhya is also a female-led organization. I think for the longest time, so while we are three of us, two are female co-founders, and I think a lot of times the conversation actually when you are very young, when you're very early, a lot of conversations also around revolve around gender and how will you sustain a family and so on and so forth. So actually for us, genuinely one of the big barriers in the initial stages was also around around gender and early support as well. So would like to highlight that further as well, but would love to hear from more people. Thank you.
Thanks, Vedant. Very interesting, because I think we hear two sides of the coin, right? A lot of organizations are supported because they are led by sort of women, and then on the other side you have this pull as well. Interesting to hear that dynamic. Anyone else from the group? Should we move on maybe to question 2, and we can always come back to some of the funding barriers if there are any organizations that have seen innovative financing vehicles that have addressed the question of innovation, the question of systems change. Please do share, or contrary to that, on the funding side, if there are any funders in the group who would like to share experiences of their own organizations who have worked on addressing some of these barriers, it would be great to hear from you. Maybe Vedant, if Labhya has seen any such innovative instruments, if you would like to share your thoughts on that.
Sure. No, thank you. I think two types of support that were very extremely catalytic for us, I think, was when someone came forward and supported us towards our monitoring and evaluation piece, which was very catalytic, I believe. The other one was towards, so travel is one of the big expenses that Labhya used to incur, because we were also scaling to other governments. We were trying to get governments convinced and so on and so forth. So actually, a lot of the unrestricted capital at that early stage really enabled us both from, so two fundings. One is M&E, and the other one is towards towards travel and a lot of the other overheads potentially that a lot of organizations at an early stage can really would be, be very, very innovative at an early stage, because we are constantly trying to do different things, and some things will fail, some things might succeed. But if one can invest in some of these, aspects at an early stage, it would be very catalytic for organizations to come back with that evidence and say, hey, we tried this and hence it did not work, right? So I think that was very innovative for us at an early stage at Labhya, but would love to hear more from other folks as well. Thank you. Thank you, Supriya.
And that's a great point, just around unrestricted capital, especially in the early stages, in order to experiment and invest in certain overheads or sort of administrative areas that you couldn't tap into for programmatic funding. I think that's one great area. Maybe also, if you're looking at building organizational capabilities, looking at instruments like impact bonds, for example, that really build organizational capabilities. And so if anyone has had experience with those kinds of innovations, or as Vedant mentioned, just sort of unrestricted, flexible capital provided by funders, it would be great to hear.
Supriya, if I may also clarify, so in this question, can we also think about innovative financing that we've seen that we would like to sort of avail, even if we haven't really experienced it ourselves as a funder or a funder? All right, thank you.
I think that's a very good point, Sejal, because I think for us, while I think a lot of the funders and so on and so forth, we are constantly asked, how much did we spend last year, right? And I think if that vocabulary can be changed, what did you want to spend, right? I think what was your audacious goal of raising that much, right? I think at an early stage when we are, I think it's much later that organizations go for multi-year commitments or get multi-year commitment, and we're able to create multi-year budgets and so on and so forth. At an early stage, Indian nonprofits having that kind of clarity and that budget or support is unheard of, right? Broadly, especially when you add the lens of young people on top of it, right? It is unheard of. You're genuinely in a survival instinct and a survival mode, right? So I think if the conversation can be much more around what did you want to raise and what was your audacious goal for that year of raising that much. I think that could be an interesting way that I would urge potentially some of our funders to think about and ask those questions much more than what did last year budget look like, right? So I think that could be interesting. Yeah.
Am I framing this correctly? Just hope and plan of
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
organization.
Yeah. What was
Yeah.
their aspiration? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
This is great. Thank you.
That's great to hear, and also good best practice for funders like us to implement. So I would be curious to know from other organizations, what are the kinds of questions that funders should be asking, and what is the kind of capital you look forward to. And like Sejal said, it doesn't have to be something that's already happening with the organization.
Supriya, would love to potentially, given that, would love to hear what are some of the things that organizations can also provide upfront to give the funder more clarity, to give the funder more conviction towards some of these questions. And while funders are also transparent, but how can the organizations also come off as authentic, while and answer the right questions in the right way? Would love to hear how you have seen that evolving, or what would you want it to be?
Sure, Vedant. That's a great question. I think the way we look at authenticity of organizations is, one is, of course, the track record of the organization, and then you see the kind of impact that the organization has had in the past. But where that becomes a challenge is with more early stage organizations, where you have younger sort of founders, and you have really dynamic founders with great models, right? And I think it's about how do you identify there that the organization is being authentic in its goal. For us there, things that we look at is sort of the openness of the organization to share certain challenges with funders, right? In terms of, where did we try programs and where did they fail? What are the reasons for sort of, those programs failing, and what would be the changes now going forward? I think the second thing is the hunger to sort of have really strong systems and processes in place within the organization to build resilience, right? So to know that, to have some sort of a business acumen, if I may word that differently, to know that, there is, yes, we are passionate about the program, we know everything that's required, but how do we then take this to scale? So for example, with Labhya, having that targeted approach of working with the Delhi government and working with the state governments to really scale the program, I think that kind of targeted approach is again something that we're really keen to see. And while earlier a lot of our funding went towards more scaled programs, over a period of time, we are looking at earlier stage innovative models with dynamic young founders that we would like to support as well. So these are some areas that helps.
Very insightful. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. Maybe we could jump to the other one. What do you think, Supriya?
Sure. So I think maybe the last question, and also want to open up to the group because we haven't heard too many voices from the group today, in terms of, any other areas around, working on systems change, working on long-term funding, both from the funder perspective, also from the organization's perspective, that you would like to dive dive deeper into. So, I mean, maybe let's start with this question around what steps would we take to aspire towards longer term capital in emerging fields like social emotional learning, mental health, etc. But also opening the floor for larger discussion around what the participants may be interested to know.
Hi, it's me again. I feel like for this one, because we work with a lot of donor from overseas, so I feel like regular engagement, maybe like have a meetup every 3 to 6 months, like maybe twice a year, would actually help on set the trend, or maybe what is the next year focus on the donor side, and so we can prepare ourselves to try to catch up or put the trajectory of the new project that we would like to work in near future together. It's like close collaboration between donor and recipient.
Absolutely. No, that's a great point. I think donors being transparent with their strategies is as important, and understanding where the donor wants to go in the future with that strategy and how aligned is the organization with that is very important. I completely resonate with increased collaboration between donors. Absolutely.
Hi, I'm Sumedha from Make a Difference, and I had two questions related to that actually. So the first one would be, since Make a Difference has been in the sector for some time now, it's been 16 years almost. So, you know, when the emerging fields come up and when a lot of capital is being deployed in like the emerging fields, so what happens to the ones who have like a more traditional or conventional approach towards it? So like, how do they resurface or, you know, encourage donors to, you know, give back to them? So that's one thing that's coming to my mind right now. So I can go ahead with the next question after I get an answer for that probably.
Sure, Sumedha. No, that's an interesting question. I mean, did I get your question right? That what happens to more traditional models and traditional organizations?
Right.
That's a very interesting question, because I mean, usually we get questions from the other side in terms of, you know, why not looking at more emerging fields, because a lot of our work is in traditional fields of, you know, improving foundational literacy and numeracy, improving, you know, primary healthcare, looking at things like the environment, which are topics that a lot of organizations, funders already work in. But then what about looking at spaces like mental health, or looking at spaces like governance, you know, which are sort of newer topics, or social emotional learning, you know, fund. So it's interesting to flip that question around and say, if, you know, more organizations are looking at fields, what happens to the traditional fields? I think for a lot of us, the traditional fields, I can speak for LGTVP, is sort of here to stay. There's a lot more that needs to be explored even within foundational literacy and numeracy, in terms of measurement, in terms of impact, etc. You know, in terms of different types of funding to these sectors. There's a lot more to be explored in terms of intersectionalities. When you're looking at education and healthcare, how can you work in the intersection between the two? So I think we are here to stay in terms of, you know, the traditional organizations, and progress in that journey towards more unrestricted funding for these organizations, towards more organizational support rather than programmatic support, while also starting to engage into newer fields that we haven't explored before. So I don't think for us it's a question of one versus the other, but would love to hear, in your experience, have you seen, you know, funders focusing more on newer areas where there's been a lower focus on traditional areas?
Yeah, so like, you know, when we talk about mental health or, you know, newer communities which various organizations are supporting, so that's when I think, you know, the funders kind of try to deploy their capital towards those organizations specifically, right? And also, like, when like you said earlier, also a lot of discussions happen around that when a woman is leading an organization, so that kind of gets some kind of support. But whereas like in certain traditional approaches where innovation kind of probably is there, but it kind of falls short as compared to the others which are emerging now, so then what happens? So I think, yeah, thank you for your answer. It kind of like really helped. And my second question would be to understand related to how do we as like organizations who have sustained in this ecosystem for some time, establish that relationship with donors who will, year on basis will support us, and it will not just be like, a 2-year thing or a 3-year thing, because that's a challenge which we have been facing for quite some time now. So that's something also I would want to.
Absolutely. Those are great points, Sumedha. And in terms of multi-year, commitments and funding, that's something we're seeing across the community, right? And that's something that, we as VP also want to socialize a multi-year approach towards funding and completely acknowledge that, that's is very needed within the sector. And so, yeah, it would be great to focus more funders around a multi-year approach. I see someone else who's raised their hand. Sumedha, I hope I've
Yes.
answered.
Can I?
Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Sorry. Hello.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi. This is Tulip from Nama Foundation. Thanks to everybody that has shared their input. But as a funding organization, now the other organizations that seek funds raised a concern of having the funding organizations continue to fund them. But we as a funding organization also have a concern about the organizations that we fund not being sustainable. So is there anyone that can share their experiences and how, for example, the organizations that receive funds can be sustainable in a maybe 3 years or 5 years period? Thank you. Was my question clear?
Yes, very clear.
Okay.
So I think on the funding side, how does the funder get comfort around the organization being sustainable in order to provide the multi-year funding?
Exactly that. Yes, thank you very much.
Anyone who would like to weigh in?
Seems like we have about less than a minute, Supriya, before we head to the main room.
Great.
Thank
you to everyone for sharing your points. And, I have a similar question to the last point that was just raised in terms of sustainability. And one way that we as funders look at that is to look at the other funders that come in, other like-minded funders who would come in and support the organization long term. So maybe that's one answer that we could think of or brainstorm around. But thank you all for weighing in. If there are any last minute thoughts from anybody, would love to hear.
Supriya, just wanted to check whether your group has finished the discussion.
Yes, Amanda, we had a good conversation, yeah.
All right, perfect. So I think everyone is back in the room again. So thank you everyone for the excellent discussion. Before I invite our facilitators to share just a bit of what they had heard from their participants, I just wanted to let everyone know that there will be a time for a Q&A, a short Q&A after this. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask the speakers, please feel free to just think of them now and then later pop them into the chat box. We also had sent out a Google form to everyone to see whether you had any questions. So I think some of you have put some of that down, and we can also share that with Richard and Supriya later on. Okay, So maybe we can start with my group. My group was led by Richa. So Richa, would you like to, if you have the Jamboard with you, would you like to share a bit of what your group has discussed? So maybe I can share my screen as well.
Sure. Thank you so much, Amanda. And thank you everyone for participating in the breakout room and sharing openly. Really, really appreciated. Couple of really interesting things came up, and I'm sure that we must continue these conversations beyond today's conversation as well, because of how deeply interested everyone is in these questions and our discussions. The first thing was that which some of our breakout room participants very accurately pointed out. For example, young people talking about the urgency to support them, but more importantly, understanding that young people in general are not a homogeneous group, and hence we need to build an ecosystem that truly understands that young people have various dynamic needs. How do funders support those needs? And more importantly, when we talk about youth-led ventures and organizations, how do we continuously support them through thick and thin? And really understanding how we can make a recommendation system happening, where even though funders and resource providers who don't necessarily support nonprofits or a particular cause, how can they start connecting and opening up their networks to folks who might be genuinely interested in supporting a work that aligns with their strategy, with their vision, with where they want to contribute most and the causes that they want to contribute most to. The second question was around what are some innovative financing vehicles or best practices that we could tap into as a collective, as nonprofits, and also as resource providers. And largely it was around really looking beyond the numbers, thinking about what else organizations need to really thrive and build that long-term sustainability, and hear things from the youth perspective, especially when talking about youth-led organizations. Second is tailoring the support across the needs of what young people need, and simplifying or building transparent outcomes between resource providers and nonprofits. So beyond the regular financial statements and regulations, how can we truly share what really means success to us, and also financial transparency beyond the regulatory constraints that we have, which can build more trust and long-term relationships between resource providers and organizations. And one interesting suggestion was to build collaboratives around causes that are yet to be defined in a standard way. For example, mental health, life skills, social emotional learning, and how we can build onto the wisdom and the collective wisdom of both resource providers and nonprofits and organizations doing the work on ground to truly build a common ground of nomenclature, so that it becomes more transparent and more resource providers feel comfortable sharing their resources in these causes. Lastly, we talked about what steps we might take to deploy long-term capital in emerging fields and challenging fields like mental health. And we spoke about how we can really build more access to the right kind of capital, to the right kind of funders for nonprofits. And like Dr. Shahani very correctly said, a lot of good people who are wanting to give to good causes may not even know what is a good nonprofit, or who is a good nonprofit to give to. And many nonprofits who are doing good work are often met with closed doors, and hence how can we really bridge that gap? And I think here plugging in the Youth Opportunities platform makes a lot of sense to me, because I've seen how powerful it can be, and I'm sure Amanda can talk more to that towards the end of our session. So that's mainly what we spoke about in a nutshell, but I'm sure much more needs to be done and said in the same breath.
Thank you so much, Richa, for summarizing that. I'll now pass it on to Supriya to give us a flavor of what your team has discussed.
Thanks, Amanda. I think with our team, the first question around, do you agree with the funding barriers and the approaches? I think the discussion was around one funding barrier, which is a lack of sort of collaboration between funders themselves. So one example that was shared was that, different funders, especially in early stages, sort of work in different directions and different strategies with the organization. So for example, there may be a gender focus with one organization and a focus on other areas with others. And so it restricts the flexibility of the organization to be able to innovate. And so it could lead to an environment where there is a lack of innovation. So that was one of the points that we discussed. The second was in terms of also looking at funding barriers, like I mentioned, specifically the early stages of the organization, and the organization being able to take those risks. We also discussed, interestingly, funding barriers in terms of women-led organizations, and explored both sides of that coin, where with some funders there are questions around, especially sort of looking at more youth-led organizations and women-led organizations in terms of sustainability of those organizations, where that could be a concern with certain funders. And on the other side, we also explored that sometimes, with women-led organizations, there is increased traction, where more funders would like to support those types of organizations. So these were a few points that we discussed there. In terms of the second question, in terms of the innovative finance vehicles, we spoke about the importance of unrestricted funding, especially in the early stages of the organization, which is required to experiment with the model, and also required to spend in areas such as overheads, working with monitoring and evaluation and travel, etc., which could be key to the organization's model, especially initially. And so looking at that flexible, unrestricted capital being provided to organizations at an early stage was one. A second point we discussed was, how can we bring in different types of funding, for example, impact bonds, which focus on building out organizational capabilities and resilience that could sustain even beyond the life cycle of that bond. And finally, when asked the question around, not just what the organizations have seen till date, but what would you like to see in terms of addressing funding barriers? The point was that we should look at addressing the aspiration of the organization more broadly, and that funders should ask key questions about, what is the aspiration of the organization beyond the 1 year, not just focusing on the past track record of the last year, of the budgets that have been spent in the last year, etc., but what is that sort of bigger audacious goal that the organization would like to achieve. And there was an interesting exchange about, how do we as funders look more into asking these broader questions, and what do we as funders look at while supporting organizations, especially that are in the early stages that do not have track records. And finally, in terms of looking at unexplored emerging fields like mental health, for example, there was a very interesting disruptive thought around, how do we as organizations as funders support traditional sectors when there is an emergence of fields like mental health, etc. And do these emerging fields, take away, for the lack of a better word, from the traditional fields that have existed, that have a lot more to build around, and a lot more innovations that can take place within these traditional fields. So that was one key question. A second one was in terms of looking at donor organization collaboration, and saying that, it's not only the organization, but also the donor that needs to share their strategies in the years going forward, and look at how well the organizations align with donor strategies. And finally, there was an interesting question from a funding organization to say that, what is it as a funder, how is it as a funder that we could trust organizations to also sustain when we look at multi-year funding opportunities. So while funders would like to support organizations on a multi-year basis, what is the guarantee that there will be the sustainability of that organization across these multiple years? So these were some of the points that we discussed. A lot of questions, great for us to go back and reflect both on the donor and the organization side.
Wow, I love this. I love that there are so many curious questions that came out of this. And you know what I think we can do at ABPN is really to collate some of these insights, some of these questions, put that together and really bring it back to the team, right? To see, how can we as an ecosystem builder also try to bring our members together to tackle some of these issues that have been raised or these questions that have been raised as well. Okay, we are left with 15 minutes, and I think there is maybe 5 minutes that we can use to have a quick Q&A. I know that Ravi has raised his hand, so I think I will pass it to Ravi to maybe ask the speakers a question.
Sure, thank you, Amanda. So I also touched this briefly with Richa, but I wanted to have your thoughts as well. So I represent iSaksham, and we build rural local young women as leaders of change in very backward districts of Bihar. And I just wanted to understand how Big Bang philanthropies see sense of agency itself as an independent primary outcome of the intervention, or does it always get linked to shift in life outcome indicators like education, health, or economic self-reliance? Could you hear me? Was this a clear question?
Yes, absolutely. So your question was around how do funders in the Big Bang Philanthropy Network look at, building agency as an outcome versus just looking at, say, reach or life end outcomes within education, health, etc. No, that's a great question. And I think we reflect on that as we develop our strategy. We have a yearly process of looking into our strategy. I think that's a very, very key question, right? So two parts to this. One is looking at, sort of reach numbers or end, outcomes as one thing versus procedural or intermediate outcomes like building agency, right? And I think what we've realized through our investments is a lot of times while reach indicators give us a general sense of scale, etc., it's so important to understand these intermediate procedural outcomes like building agency. What we have also understood through this is, building agency impacts a lot of the sectors that we work on. So for example, with FES, an organization that we support, it is about building communities, agency, giving them access to lands. But that in turn ends up impacting their education outcomes, their health outcomes, because an Anganwadi center gets built there. They have access to a lot more schemes, etc. And so exploring these intersectionalities and between the various sectors is also something we're doing a lot more of. So speaking about us in the Big Bang Philanthropy Network, that's definitely an area we're moving towards. We're also having larger conversations with the co-impact, with the SCOL, etc., in terms of creating these common indicators that all of us as funders could look at and sort of move in the same direction instead of pulling in different directions. I hope that helps in terms of answering.
This really helps. And also, I was also on a personal note happy to see that there's a thinking around transitioning and also seeing sense of agency, recognizing its importance both as a procedural indicator, but also it could also be an outcome indicator of its own, because we know it has huge knock-on and ripple effects on different aspects of life. Thank you for saying that.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you, Supriya. I see that Akhil, you also have a question. Please feel free.
Yes, I'm sorry I keep on asking all these questions, but all right. So, okay, so I'm from the education industry, so I always look at everything through a sort of like a teaching education lens. So people like Richa are brilliant, and they have access to mentors and a great way to sort of develop themselves as an entrepreneur to scale up. The other side is that funders who put on a lot of money into program. However, and of course, as you know, with Unlimited, which I'm also running, there may be a model where there is a funder pay model for developing the entrepreneur themselves, right? Because what happens is that you want to make sure that, let's say, whoever's running the nonprofit or the NGO needs to develop themselves. Now, the thing is that as it is, money for admin is so little, and you have to pay salaries of accounts and rent. Do you believe that there is an area for funders to say, hey, you know, we will also allocate money for educating the entrepreneur, or at least if they take any course to develop themselves, we believe that that's worth putting as admin. So, I don't know, so actually anyone, most welcome to answer.
Maybe I'll take a crack at it and would love to hear Richa's side of it as well. I think Dr. Akhil, completely agree with you, you know, and as an organization that supports founders and teams, for us, the capacity of the founder is really important. So what we do with a lot of our organizations is have a separate grant on building leadership. You know, we hire a sort of third-party agency who can work closely with these entrepreneurs to build in certain capabilities, and especially on the leadership side, etc. We're also speaking to other funders who have best practices in these areas. So for example, Omidyar Network has an entrepreneur in residence program where they support entrepreneurs. You know, a Co-Impact is working very closely on building systems thinking and gender sort of thinking within entrepreneurs. And so having these regular exchanges with funders that are building entrepreneurial capacity is something we do. And thirdly, sort of bringing in portfolio organizations together is also something that's very important to us, where one entrepreneur can sort of learn from another, right? And share their experiences. And I think that peer-to-peer learning is so valuable within our portfolio as well. So these are three sort of initial reflections, but I'll hand over to Richa.
Thank you for sharing, Supriya, and thank you for your question, Dr. Shahani. Actually, a couple of thoughts. One, I feel as an early stage organization, many times we need capital just to do. But as we move ahead in our growth phase, we need capital to build. And I think when we raise capital to build, that is where we need capital to also build our own selves and our teams and our own capacity building. And we also have the time and the bandwidth to actually invest in our own capacity as well, right? Which is the phase that, say, for example, Labdhya is in right now. And I think understanding that from a donor perspective is also extremely important, that in the first few years of the organization, we are the ones who are doing pretty much everything. And, you know, we are fundraising, we're also going on ground. And in that time, it's very, very much founder-led. But as we move ahead in our journey now, you know, we are in a space where we genuinely have the time and the bandwidth, and now we also understand our own strengths and areas of development in order to work on them. And I think it's very mature of you know, foundations and organizations like yours and Unlimited who recognize that, yes, capacity building is important. And I feel like the second part to that is also in the growth stage of organizations, we are constantly recruiting senior leadership positions and people there who genuinely need a sort of orientation time and again in their own capacity, and generally also to the culture of the organization, to build a team, build people who will sort of go up the ladder in the organization also. So very important, of course, it's a dream come true to find resource providers who understand that and are able to support that. And at the same time, I think as a founder and as a person in senior leadership, it's also important on our part as people who are doing to understand when is the time to do and when is the time to build, and when to ask for support in the growth and the sort of lifespan of the organization.
Thanks.
But would love to hear from anyone else in the audience as well, if you have any thoughts. Or if Amanda, we're getting out of time, then please check us.
Yes, we have 8 minutes left. So time really flies. I would say that I think if there are any more questions that come, we can collate them and then we can send it to both the speakers. But I think we might have to start wrapping it up. So I think what we can do right now, perhaps as we close off, is really just to see whether Richa and Supriya, do you have any other closing remarks? And how you might want to summarize, what you have heard from today, what might be some of the lessons you might have taken away. Please feel free to share.
Supriya, do you want to go first?
Sure, Richa. No, I wanted to thank AVP and Richa and also all of everyone who joined into the call today for the very rich insights that we've got. I think for me, as a funder, the learnings that I have is especially in terms of supporting early stage innovative organizations, just to understand and build sort of the flexibility of the funding that we provide. I think that's something definitely, I will take back and reflect on that with not only my own organization, but the other funders that we're in touch with. I think too, also as funders, we tend to be sort of live in our own worlds to some extent. And so to understand that this kind of funding is actually really valuable, this unrestricted multi-year funding that supports systems change. I think that's great to know and very reassuring to us, and something that we will continue to socialize with other funders as well, in the hopes that, we can build a supportive ecosystem around that overall. So thank you again, everybody, for your insights.
Thank you, Supriya. And just echoing the same, couple of weeks back, my co-founders and I were trying to summarize what have been our biggest learnings in the past couple of years and what have led to our success, whatever we define it as. And of course, there is much more to do, much more to be supported for. So the three words that we came up with, which I think also, sort of came up in our discussions today, one was transparency. The other one was authenticity, and the next one was audacity. And I feel like if there was an equation to really building true, authentic, long-term relationships with each other's as equals, people who understand each other's challenges, maybe these three values could really, really come in handy if we could see how we could verbalize them, practice them, and truly, truly demonstrate them in various through thick and thin. I think that's what I'm taking away. And of course, a lot of interesting questions, some I don't have answers to, and so I'm curious to learn more and get back to you on. But thank you so much for making the time.
Perfect, thank you. This is a great way to end our webinar today, but definitely more to come. Before we do close, I would just like to invite everyone to perhaps, as we close, just scan the QR code that we have here, really just for the rest of the participants, to really just share, what might be your takeaways as well. We would love to hear from you all, and of course to give us any feedback in terms of how we might continue to grow this series of deep dives, and also have you guys share some of the topics that you would like to hear more of. I also like to share, as all of you complete the survey form, to share a few announcements that we have in our pipeline. So for us at AVPN, we have an upcoming event in November, focused on this growing threat that we are seeing in Asia, which is tuberculosis. I think as the pandemic, we are passing, I suppose, in the post-pandemic phase, we are seeing that tuberculosis is causing an increase in death during this time. And so this forum that we are partnering with Johnson & Johnson will bring key stakeholders who can play a role in TB elimination to come together. So this will be a youth-centered event, especially since TB affects youth and children the most. So if any of you are interested, I'd like to just share the link here in the group chat below for you to find out more. If you would like to join AVPN as outreach partners to share this with your own organization, with your own networks, to join this event as participants, as partners, please let me know as well, and we will connect you with the events, our events colleague. Secondly, and this is actually relevant to the question that Dr. Akhil had shared with us in our group chat just now, is this idea of, can we bring people together in youth space so that people can get to know new faces, find like-minded partners, find experts, find trusted peers. And actually AVPN is going to be inviting our network to join this I would say almost like a networking platform. We are calling it Grab a Coffee because it's really a place for you to informally get to know one another, chat with one another, see who are the funders, capacity builders, the youth solutionists who are in the space, and just to know who's who. So this hub is open to AVPN members, entrepreneurs and founders, capacity builders, even governments, to really just find people whom you can bounce ideas with. There's a matchmaking algorithm in this platform that will allow you to share your experience, share your expertise or your technical skills, or look for others or other fellow experts, and we will match you with the right people in the platform. So if you would like to join us, the survey form has a link, or rather has a question at the bottom so that you can put yourself in a waiting list. And yeah, we will then invite you onto the platform, I would say by early next month. So I think that's all for today. Thank you all for your time. And I really think that everyone here has really benefited from all the conversations and insights that we have shared with one another. So I wish you a good day ahead, and thank you. Goodbye for now.
Thank you.